You spend years trying to be the kind person everyone claims to value. You hold doors. You soften your tone. You stretch your schedule like an overused gym membership you never cancel. You become the emotional equivalent of a free trial that never ends, the kind everyone enjoys, but no one intends to pay for. And somewhere along the way, you notice the quiet truth. The world is not built to reward unlimited generosity. It rewards strategy, boundaries, and demand, not the emotional equivalent of leaving the vending machine stocked and unlocked. This is the price of endless yeses, the slow, silent depreciation of your value every time you give without thinking, without limits, without asking whether the other person even wants what you're offering. You assume kindness works like a long-term investment. That, eventually, the people around you will notice the consistency, the patience, the emotional labor you quietly shovel into their lives. But human psychology doesn't work like a loyalty card that accumulates points. It works like supply and demand. The more available you are, the less you're worth. Not because you are worthless, but because unchecked abundance always collapses its own market. You live in a world where everything gets priced, compared, evaluated, even emotional energy, even goodwill. And when you give excessively, you accidentally trigger the inflation effect. You flood the emotional market. You hand out yeses like coupons that never expire. And the people around you adapt. They begin to see your effort as baseline, not exceptional. They stop noticing the weight you carry. They stop seeing your help as help. It becomes infrastructure, invisible until it breaks. You don't realize you're participating in a psychological transaction every time you soften your boundaries. Every time you say, "It's okay, I'll handle it." Every time you give someone the emotional equivalent of overnight shipping, while they offer you the slowest, cheapest option in return. There's a painful irony here. The kinder you are, the less people feel the need to reciprocate. It's not malice, it's human adaptation. People respond to incentives. If something is always available, always patient, always forgiving, then there is no urgency to value it. No pressure to return the favor. No psychological nudge that says, "Hey, this matters." And you don't help the situation. You keep pretending your energy is infinite. You keep showing up like customer service with no closing hours. You keep believing that moral goodness is self-sustaining, that being a good person protects you from exploitation the way a warranty protects a new appliance. But you forget something essential. Endless giving without limits is not generosity. It's self-erasure with a pretty label. You might not notice the erosion at first. It shows up quietly. You feel tired, but you push through. You feel overlooked, but you rationalize it. You feel the early sting of resentment, but you bury it under more politeness. And each time you silence yourself, you reinforce an unconscious message. My needs don't matter. Only my usefulness does. And people believe you. You become the person who will always pick up the slack, the emotional janitor, the human bumper cushion, the one who absorbs the friction so others don't have to. You build a life where everyone else's comfort is optimized, while your own is negotiated down like a clearance sale. The tragedy is simple. You think you're doing the right thing. You think you're being noble. You think you're playing some long game where kindness eventually pays out. But what you're actually doing is removing the very friction that teaches others to appreciate you. Kindness without boundaries creates people who take you for granted, not because they're evil, but because you taught them the wrong price for your presence. This is how naive good people collapse, not from one catastrophic betrayal, but from 1,000 tiny discounts on their own worth. You don't notice the breakdown of reciprocity when it begins. It never arrives loudly. It doesn't slam the door or announce itself with dramatic cruelty. Instead, it trickles in, slow, subtle, like a recurring subscription charge you barely remember signing up for. A few dollars here, a few minutes there, small favors that feel harmless, until you multiply them across months, friendships, workplaces, families, and the emotional economy of your entire life. This is where you start quietly footing the bill for connections no one else is investing in. You tell yourself it's temporary. You tell yourself they'll return the support someday. You tell yourself you're being understanding, being patient, being the bigger person. But underneath, something begins to feel off, like a vending machine that only dispenses when you kick it. Except, you're the vending machine, and the kicking looks like guilt, pressure, silence, or the subtle expectation that you shouldn't complain because you've always been the reliable one. This is the emotional economy collapsing from the inside. Reciprocity is not just a social norm, it's psychological gravity. It keeps relationships balanced, stable, and anchored. When someone gives you their time, their effort, or their empathy, your brain naturally feels a pull to return something of equal weight, not out of obligation, but out of alignment. But when you are always the one giving, always the one smoothing conflict, softening tone, managing logistics, adjusting your schedule, that gravity disappears, not because other people stop caring, but because you stop requiring balance. You become the person who doesn't need much, the person who gets it, the person who won't make a fuss, the person who understands. And in the emotional market, the less you ask for, the less people believe you're worth giving to. This is the gratitude paradox. The more self-sufficient you appear, the fewer people feel compelled to support you. They look at you and think, they're fine. They always figure it out. Gratitude quietly evaporates, not out of cruelty, but out of cognitive bias. People save their emotional energy for situations that seem urgent, dramatic, or visibly in need. Your quiet competence becomes camouflage. Your stability becomes a reason others give you less. And because you internalize this dynamic, you work even harder. You compensate for the absence of reciprocity by increasing your output. More help, more patience, more emotional labor. You start treating relationships like failing gym memberships. You throw more effort at them because you already paid so much, even when you know the results aren't improving. This is the sunk cost fallacy disguised as devotion. But the deeper collapse happens internally. Every favor you give without return chips away at your sense of worth, like a loyalty card that keeps getting stamped but never redeems a reward. You start feeling unimportant, but you don't say it. You start feeling invisible, but you mask it with cheerfulness. You start feeling used, but you frame it as kindness. Eventually, you stop recognizing that your exhaustion is evidence of imbalance. Meanwhile, the people around you adapt to the emotional subsidy you provide. They don't notice how heavy things are for you because you carry everything silently. They don't see the cost of your generosity because you've hidden the receipts. They don't realize the emotional economy is bankrupt because you keep refinancing it with your own self-worth. Reciprocity fails gradually, then suddenly. One day, you wake up and realize you're surrounded by people who care about you in theory, but rarely in practice. People who applaud your strength, but never support it. People who compliment your character, but never contribute to your life. People who benefit from the emotional scaffolding you built, but never help maintain it. And this is the moment it hits you. You didn't just give too much. You also taught people to give you too little. The emotional economy isn't unfair by default. It becomes unfair when you keep paying the cost of relationships everyone else treats as free. You don't realize how many invisible contracts you've signed. Not legal ones, psychological ones. The kind written in silence, vague gestures, unspoken hopes, and the subtle belief that if you treat people well, they'll eventually treat you the same. You think your kindness forms a mutual agreement, a quiet subscription where everyone pays their share. But invisible contracts are dangerous, not because others break them, but because they never agreed to them in the first place. You assume they notice your sacrifices. You assume they value your reliability. You assume they read your intentions the way you read theirs. But assumptions are just emotional IOUs you write to yourself. This is the heart of unspoken expectations. You create an entire mental world where your kindness has meaning, weight, and future returns, while the other person simply experiences your actions as optional gestures without binding terms. You think you're exchanging emotional currency. They think you're giving freebies. You keep offering support like an intuitive customer service system, anticipating needs before they even speak. You adjust your schedule as if their comfort is your responsibility. You give reassurance, advice, effort, and time as if some silent invoice floats between you, waiting to be honored later. But emotional invoices without explicit agreements always expire unpaid. This is why naive, good people break. They don't communicate expectations. They assume reciprocity is implied. They hope appreciation will naturally emerge. But hope is a terrible accountant. Invisible contracts create the perfect setup for disappointment. You believe you've invested in the relationship. They believe you simply enjoy being generous. You interpret your giving as a sign of commitment. They interpret it as your personality. You see loyalty. They see convenience. And the moment you need something back, real support, real presence, real effort, you feel the sharp, cold shock of realizing there was never a contract at all. Just a story you wrote in your head. This is where the gratitude paradox deepens. The more consistently you give without conditions, the more people assume your giving has no cost. Your energy becomes included. Your time becomes part of the package. Your patience becomes an unlimited plan they didn't pay for. Kindness becomes background noise, something noticed only when it stops. Here lies another painful mechanism: boundary collapse. You tell yourself you're being flexible, adaptable, understanding. But flexibility without limits becomes shapelessness. People can't see where your line is because you erased it to make room for them. There comes a point when your kindness stops looking like virtue and starts looking like a form of quiet self-abandonment. Not the dramatic kind, not the cinematic collapse where you scream into a mirror or burn your life down. No, this erosion happens the way a grocery store floor wears down under thousands of unnoticed footsteps. Slowly, invisibly, and inevitably. You don't choose boundary collapse in one bold, tragic moment. You slip into it through a series of tiny self-negotiations. Micro discounts on your own needs. Small compromises you tell yourself are no big deal. Minor sacrifices you frame as generosity. You give someone more time, more space, more emotional labor, because it feels easier than stating what you need. And every time you do this, you dilute the sense that you are a person with limits. Your boundaries become like an old gym membership, technically yours, but rarely used. You know it exists. You know it matters. You keep telling yourself you'll fix it later. But you don't. Because enforcing boundaries feels confrontational, and being good has always felt safer than being honest. So you let people overstep, gently at first, then casually, then habitually. This is the slow erosion of self. You begin by telling yourself you're being understanding. Then you begin telling yourself you're being patient. Eventually, you stop telling yourself anything at all. You simply absorb the impact, the way a badly designed customer service line absorbs endless complaints because the system is built to support everyone except the one doing the work. You become that system. Reliable, predictable, always available. But here's the truth no one likes to hear. Predictability without boundaries turns you into infrastructure, not a human being. People walk across bridges without thanking them. They assume the support will always be there. They assume the structure won't fail. They assume the maintenance happens magically, without cost, without exhaustion. You start living like that bridge, so they keep stepping forward, not out of malice, but because the floor is flat and you never marked the edge. And the worst part? Your silence creates the illusion that everything is fine. The more you hold back your true needs, the more others believe you have none. The more you absorb discomfort, the more others assume you're unaffected. The more you pretend you're okay, the more invisible your suffering becomes. This is the emotional equivalent of a subscription model gone wrong. You keep upgrading the service while the user still believes they're on the free plan. Your life becomes a series of unpaid emotional invoices and automatic renewals. Invisible contracts, unspoken expectations, boundary collapse, self-deception loops. They all feed into one outcome: resentment. Not loud resentment, not aggressive resentment, but a quiet, corrosive kind. The kind that eats away at your self-respect, grain by grain. You start thinking, I did so much. Why didn't they appreciate it? But deep down, you know the truth. You never actually asked them to. You never expressed the cost. You never negotiated the terms. You played a game they didn't know they were in. And the moment you realize this, truly realize it, something inside you shifts. A bitter clarity takes shape. You understand that people didn't fail the contract. The contract never existed. You were both living in different economies, one emotional, one transactional. You were giving as investment. They were taking as convenience. And the collapse was built into the silence from the very beginning. Your emotional landscape shifts from open terrain to a service corridor. Your day becomes about accommodating others. Your energy becomes something you ration carefully because so little comes back. You notice that every "Are you free?" feels like a summons, that every "Can you help?" feels like a subtle obligation, and that every "You're so reliable" feels less like a compliment and more like a life sentence. Boundary collapse isn't just about saying yes too often. It's about forgetting you were allowed to say no. And the people around you, again, not out of cruelty, but out of habit, begin to treat your accommodation as the default operating system. They don't register your weariness. They don't see the small flinches you hide. They don't notice the internal negotiation you perform every time you want to decline, but can't. Your compliance disguises your discomfort. Meanwhile, under the surface, something begins to dry out. Your self-respect, your clarity, your sense of personal gravity. When boundaries erode, you don't just lose protection, you lose shape. You start feeling like a vague outline of yourself, present, functioning, useful, but not fully alive. You drift into a state of learned helplessness, where the idea of asking for what you need feels foreign, excessive, or burdensome. You silence yourself before anyone else even has the chance to. You think you are avoiding conflict, but what you are actually avoiding is yourself. This erosion shows up everywhere. You apologize more. You shrink your preferences. You accept situations that drain you. You tolerate behaviors that bruise you. You let other people's convenience outweigh your well-being. You become fluent in self-minimizing, the subtle art of making your discomfort smaller so someone else's comfort can stay intact. But there is a cost, a quiet, heavy, accumulating cost. Every boundary you fail to hold becomes a withdrawal from your internal bank account. And one day, you discover you're overdrawn, emotionally bankrupt, running on fumes and reflexes. You wake up and hardly recognize the life you're maintaining. You wonder when you stopped being a participant and became a service provider. You didn't break. You eroded. And erosion always feels like nothing until it's everything. The collapse of naive good people isn't sudden. It's gradual, polite, and devastatingly silent. You don't lose yourself in one moment. You lose yourself by 1,000 unspoken no's. There's a moment, subtle, quiet, almost weightless, when something in you finally stops. Not a dramatic explosion, not an emotional breakdown, more like the soft click of a door you didn't realize had been left open for years. You feel it in your chest first, a kind of internal stillness, an absence of the old impulse to fix, to soften, to accommodate. It's the moment when the psychological machinery that kept you giving finally grinds to a halt. This is the snap, the quiet recalibration of a person who has spent too long subsidizing everyone else's comfort. It doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels strange, like walking out of a supermarket and realizing you accidentally left something in the cart. A faint sense of incompleteness, a pull toward the old instinct. Shouldn't I be doing more? Shouldn't I reach out? Shouldn't I apologize just to keep the peace? But you don't. Not because you're angry, not because you want revenge, but because the energy simply isn't there anymore. Loss aversion dies before you even notice it. You're no longer afraid of losing people who were never truly present. You're no longer afraid of disappointing those who took your devotion for granted. You're no longer afraid of stepping back because you finally understand that stepping forward was costing you everything. This is the death of sunk cost thinking, the end of the mindset that told you to keep investing in one-sided relationships simply because you'd already given so much. You stop seeing your kindness as leverage. You stop waiting for reciprocity that never arrives. You stop trying to earn loyalty through effort. You finally see the truth. Some relationships aren't broken. They're just mispriced. You've been offering premium care in a world that kept you on the free trial tier. When the snap happens, you stop overspending emotionally. You stop offering emotional discounts. You stop negotiating your value down to something others will accept. You feel a sudden clarity about what you will and won't tolerate, not out of bitterness, but out of accuracy. You've recalculated the cost. People may notice the shift. They might ask why you're quieter, less available, slower to respond. They might interpret your boundaries as coldness. They might call your distance changed behavior, as if your former selflessness was the natural state, and this new clarity is an anomaly. But you know better. This isn't the new you. This is the real you, the one who existed before kindness became a survival strategy. You stop running your life like a failing business. You stop offering unlimited emotional labor as if you're trying to win customer retention awards. You stop inflating your availability to fill the silence. You stop treating your attention like public property. You begin pricing your presence in accordance with its true value, not the discounted rate others became accustomed to. And when you do this, something remarkable happens. Your world becomes smaller, quieter, and more honest. The people who only stayed for the benefits drift away because the benefits are gone. The ones who relied on your silence begin to feel uncomfortable because silence is no longer your currency. The relationships built on invisible contracts dissolve because there are no longer any unspoken terms for them to profit from. But the space that remains is cleaner, uncluttered, real. You start noticing who steps forward when you stop moving first. You start recognizing who values you without needing constant access to you. You begin seeing reciprocity not as a miracle, but as a natural filter. And most importantly, you feel a quiet rebuilding of your own internal gravity, a sense that you no longer orbit around others, but around yourself. This is not a revenge arc. It's a rebalancing. The collapse of naive good people always ends here, in the calm, grounded realization that being good was never the problem. Being boundaryless was. Being generous wasn't the mistake. Being endlessly available was. Kindness wasn't your downfall. Self-neglect was. You finally understand that walking away isn't cruelty. It's bookkeeping. You are no longer subsidizing the emotional costs of others. You're simply paying attention to your own. And for the first time in a long time, the emotional economy is finally back in balance. There's a quiet shift that comes after everything you've learned. Not loud, not triumphant, not cinematic. More like the slow exhale you didn't know you'd been holding for years. You begin to understand that your worth was never supposed to be measured by how much you could endure, how often you could say yes, or how gracefully you could absorb the weight of other people's expectations. Being good was never the flaw. Being unguarded was. You see now that boundaries aren't walls. They're windows. They let the right people in and keep the wrong ones from wandering too deep. You learn to give without draining, to care without erasing yourself, to love without turning into the emotional infrastructure of everyone else's life. You learn that reciprocity is not a luxury. It is the quiet proof that connection is real. And as you move forward, you carry a new kind of softness. Not the softness that gets taken for granted, but the grounded calm that comes from knowing you can choose where your energy flows. You stop chasing validation because you finally understand that respect grows from clarity, not sacrifice. And you stop apologizing for the space you take up because you know now that your presence has value, even when you are silent. Rest in that truth for a while.